Thank you, Jim, for coming to talk about your new book, University Ethics: How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics. What led you to the writing of this book?
I kept looking at a variety of instances on campus, not on BC's campus, but on campuses across the country. And I kept noticing that there was a variety of scandals going on. There was Penn State, there were questions of sexual abuse that had happened, there were cases of sexual assault of students on campus, there were issues of whether athletes were fairly treated and were athletes actually getting an education. There was a question of the adjuncts faculty and whether they were being rightly treated, and the answer is not well in many, many instances. I began to think about how tuition is not really sustainable, not at the increases that we have. I began to ask other questions about race, about class. Most people don't talk about the class differentiations on a campus, and many students who are coming from the working class, they have a very hard time on many American campuses. I started thinking about hazing, and I saw all these things, and I said, they're all happening in one place. Is that an issue? And I wanted to ask this big question, is this incidental or not that it's happening at a university? And once I bought into the possibility that the university setting was constitutive of all these instances, these scandals that were happening, I began to talk to colleagues of mine and say, I really think that there's something going on. I talked to Ken Himes and John Paris, David Hollenbach, and they began to pull out clippings for me from newspapers and say, see, your hunch is really right. So I started to give talks, lectures on this. I spoke at the Society of Christian Ethics. I wrote an article in Louvain Studies over in Belgium. And I found people resonating with what I was doing. And then I started thinking of my own experience as a priest living in Boston during the sex abuse scandal. And I had been a strong critic of the way leadership in the church was handling the entire sexual abuse scandal. And my criticism then, and I had done some work on this, my criticism then was that the question of ethics, and I'm not simply talking about the predatory priest, but the question of ethics, professional ethics, being, priests being trained, seminarians being trained, that I kept commenting, I don't think there's been much training about professional ethics of the clergy and of administrators in the church. And I began to see a corollary that my experience of scandals in the church were becoming very familiar, like the scandals that I was seeing in the university. And they're both the teaching institutions of ethics. You find out morals from the church, you have all your ethics courses at the university. They're the two main teachers of ethics. And just as I had wondered about the church, whether they did any training of their personnel in ethics, I began to see that, as a matter of fact, there was a disinterest at the university on university ethics. And in fact, there's never been a book even on the topic, even though there are hundreds and hundreds of books on ethics taught at university for lawyers and doctors and for nurses and for people in all sorts of different professions. In other words, the university is teaching all these courses on ethics, but they don't have any coursework at all at any university on what it means to be a university professional. And so with that premise, I started digging in to a series of about 7 different topics to go further and to talk about what is wrong with this issue, whether it's about athletes, whether it's about adjunct faculty, whether it's about race, whether it's about sexual assault, whether it's about students behaving badly, and then say, are these connected? And so the book was to connect the dots, to say it's not about sexual assault on campus. It's not about the unfair treatment of athletes or the unfair treatment of adjuncts. It's actually about an entire culture that is not existing there. There is no real culture that promotes ethics at a university. There's a culture for teaching ethics in the other professions, but there's nothing of a culture for ethics. So I wanted to do a book that would make the case to say that the university has to make a commitment to say that they're developing a culture of ethics before they try to put in some sort of set of norms to make it compliant on some random cases. The question is really about the underlying culture. And is there any real interest in accountability, transparency, a sense of building community that's based upon right acting?
Could you say something about the process needed for establishing a university ethics?
It's funny, I'm talking next week with this person from Penn State. I wrote an article for Time magazine on my book, and I got all sorts of different mail from people about the book. And this one fellow has just been hired Penn State after the firing of their president and the coach and all the other things surrounding Sandusky. They ended up creating an office for ethics and compliance. And he wrote to me to say that, as a matter of fact, what he's trying to do is develop an underlying culture before he figures out what the norms should be for conduct. Because until you have some sort of culture that's actually interested in ethics, until it needs first, more than anything, an awareness that there's a need for this. And I'm trying to make the case. I think people have to actually see my book or see something like it or read an article that I've written or that somebody else has written about it. Until this premise that the university doesn't have any interest in a culture of ethics, until that's appreciated, there won't be an interest in it, because we've been marching on for nearly 300 years without any real desire to develop a culture of ethics. So the first thing would be an awareness. There has to be some sort of consciousness raising about the lack of commitment, a lack of interest in accountability and transparency, these ethical standards by which we say a community has the possibility of flourishing as a community. And at the end of my book, I have this, they prompted me to do something about, if I were president of a university, what would I do? And I found that at Brown University, where the president there had set up a committee to look at their history of slavery, I found that that was really rather extraordinary, because I followed a lot about that committee. When the president put that together at Brown, she really made it a significant event in Brown's University's history. And I think if somebody really wants to launch a question about developing a culture, it needs to have a convocation of significance in which it tells everyone on the university that there will be, in my case, what I suggest is a committee being formed that represents constituencies across the university. This would be from all sorts of, food service and dormitory service and police service, to athletes, to students, to faculty, both adjunct and tenure and tenure track, as well as administrators and board of trustee members, and that this cross section of persons on a manageable committee would have to begin to look to see what is it on their campus that they, by having their eyes opened to the fact that there's lack of a culture of ethics, what can they name as distinctively problematic at their particular campus? For instance, people say that where there's a strong Title IX program in sports at a campus, there's a tendency to see that there's fewer incidents of sexual assault, in part because women have a place on the campus where they can gather together, so that there's a new way of relating with one another and a new way of empowerment. I don't know how true that is, but people could ask, well, what is the climate on sexuality, sexual assault, gender differences on the campus? and then they could look at that, or they could look at what is the status of their adjunct or faculty, whether they're under some sort of more permanent contract like the professors of the practice, or whether they're just these individual momentary contracts that endure for just a semester, and what do they entail. So the first would be, after their eyes are open, could a committee actually begin to look hard at their university to see where are the lacunae in ethics, where are their demonstrable holes? And this is not to ferret out people that ought to be punished or anything like that. This is to just find where are the weaknesses, but also then to do where are the strengths. I point out in my book that I do think that the first place of ethics on a campus, in many instances, has been these women groups, especially the Take Back the Night movement, because that Take Back the Night movement is really the first time that we see a concerted effort at universities across the country to address this issue on sexual assault and harassment. And that brought an awareness to faculty and students, particularly women, but also men. And I think that they should be asking themselves, well, where do we find strengths? Do we find that do we have some good practices that are going on with our adjunct faculty? Do we have good practices going on with athletes? You know, there are some universities, some very fine universities like our own, that has a very good track record with athletes and making sure that they get a full education, that they're supported, and that we take it seriously, that they are students, and not just people who are performing for us or anything like that. So I would like them to look at what are the good practices as well as what are the lacuna that they're having. And then to begin to say, well, how could they organically develop an awareness across the campus for this? In the book, I keep saying that one of the great problems of the university is the geography of the university. I call it the geography of the university because the university is a medieval structure, and the geography of the university is not like corporate America. It really predates that. And it's what I call a set of fiefdoms, but I'm not the first to use that to describe the campus itself. So there's a certain way that academic faculty do not know what student affairs is doing. That's an enormous, two enormous fiefdoms, that the academic world and the student affairs world have domains in which there's very little overlap. And one has to ask how much of the life of the student enters the classroom and how much of the student affairs allows for the significance of academic formation as constitutive of the overall student formation. But there are other instances that faculty, if you were to ask a faculty member, I always joke, if you ask a faculty member, what does Vanderslice mean, for instance, I wonder how many would be able to say it's a dorm. I think that our world as faculty is different from the world of student affairs. But I think that happens in administration. And God knows there are more and more people in administration, and that the burgeoning staffs of the administrators has been a concern about the nature of the university, which only highlights again my issue that these are fiefdoms that are going around. And there's no real connection among them. How would this committee that I would propose work to make more transparent the workings and tasks and make more familiar what all the different fiefdoms are doing? How would we bring that into the 21st century? Because we haven't yet. So I talk about that the university structure itself impedes us from developing this culture until we acknowledge that these separate entities are functioning in pretty semi-autonomous ways. I only say semi-autonomous because the accountability is really structurally at the top, that the vice president or dean of each of these units, they meet with one another. But anybody below them doesn't meet with anybody outside their own entity. There are attempts to build, like, for instance, the difference between one department and another. Whenever there's attempt at interdisciplinarity, we see the hope of a greater transparency. But until that happens, we're really not able to get to this step of saying, well, how can we create that culture? So the biggest obstacle, I think, is the structure, the infrastructure of the university. And the second, and the other, is that the nature of the professoriate is so highly individualistic. And I mean, it's sensational right now to see these core courses going up where we see faculty in one department teaching with a faculty member in another department. This is, however, just the very beginning. I make a comment that faculty, we're only required to do 4 or 5 office hours or 6 office hours a week, but we can decide any time we want for those office hours. It's not based on, hey, if the whole university had office hours at the same time, all students would know and we would all know that one another is there. I'm not saying that faculty are not working the other 34 hours a week or whatever, that there's a presumption that they're engaged in full-time work. But even the fact that we set our own office hours, I don't know who does that. I also don't know of anybody, any professional today, who does not work in a team. Like, I'm the son of a cop. My father had his partner. Firemen and women, they have their ladder company. You cannot meet a doctor who's a single standalone doctor. He's or she is part of a group of fellow doctors. Nurses work in teams. Lawyers work in teams. Everyone works in teams. I have a good friend of mine. He was the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, and Marsh Carter. And he's taught here at the CSOM as a visiting professor on a few occasions, or at least visited and lectured here on occasion. And he said he cannot get over at all the unique individual workspace of the faculty. This is a man who's at the stock exchange. He was also the CEO of State Street in the financial market, taught ethics by professors at a university, where they learn to have to work with one another. The formation of a faculty member is so highly individual, and then the subsequent professional life is in that same individual framework, that actually fits well in these fiefdoms that I was mentioning. So until we also look at the professoriate as well as the landscape of the university, we have challenges. Just one final note. The professoriate, in order to get there, you have to do a dissertation. I don't know of any other profession that is so unaccompanied. Like, I direct lots of dissertations. I've directed more than 30 dissertations. I just had a dissertation defense yesterday. I really worked well with my student, I think. I think she thought as well. It was a good defense. Everybody was happy, But, how much time did I spend with her? I mean, I read her work. I sent her back her work. I would sit down with her on each chapter, but that was about an hour each chapter that I actually sat with her, that we were together. And then I sent a note that would go for maybe, it took me a while to read the dissertation and to coax her and stuff like that. But it's not like somebody who's working with an advisor in so many other fields of law or medicine, where there's an actual enduring relationship going on. We are highly individualistic. We teach people to be ethical in their professions. But I think we need to learn from a lot of professions how to be ethical in our own.
Students, of course, are an essential segment of the university. What ethical problems do they pose?
Well, we could start with this commodification. Commodification comes with it a sense of entitlement. I bought this, I deserve this. We see that students will tend to think that they want a grade of a certain mark rather than that they earned it or that this is the way the grades fell out. they seem to, we do see more of a sense that students are fighting over their grades, and we do find instances of their parents actually entering into this realm as well. What we do also see, though, on U.S. campuses in a way that we haven't seen before is more racial incidents. We see more and more racially themed parties that are going on. If there are universities that have any associations there on campus, any groups that are somewhat autonomous from the university, these clubs have their own problems and with a lot of racially themed parties. So we've been seeing more and more of this really just out and out racist issues. We also see on our campus today so a lot of self-segregation going on. But we have to appreciate, again, the Brown study on slavery, how there are so many predominantly white universities that were exclusively white before, that the presence of African Americans on our campuses and not at Negro colleges that have been established, that their entry into the American white university has never been adequately examined. Happily, there are a number of people who are trying to look at that today. There's a book called Ebony and Ivy that wants to look at how many of the Ivy schools were deeply connected to slavery. That's not about African Americans being on our campus as students. That was them and their connection to slavery. And then there's this expectation that suddenly our universities were going to no longer be racist. Well, how do you undo 100 years of history in which there was no intention of having African Americans on your campus? So it's that blindness of the American university. My question about ethics is similar to how did we start having so-called racial diversity on campus? We just invited people in and African Americans began to arrive, but were they welcomed? Were they given a role? Was there any acknowledgement that the university had policies that made it impossible for them to enter? Does the university own up to the fact that there are these racist issues that went unaddressed but actually heated for all this time? So we have on our campuses now a chill factor in which we see Asians and Asian Americans, Africans and African Americans. We can see a variety, we can see the Hispanics, and we see students fairly often self-selecting segregation. And I think that occasionally Student Affairs wants to address that, but one wonders where the academic persons are and what are they doing to do this. So I'd say that one of the biggest problems we have on our campus today is about race. And the other very big problem is on sexual assault. But sexual assault is deeply connected to drinking. And that's another whole issue. I think we're fairly, it's rather interesting that we have decided, it's like on drinking in the United States, we've all become members of the Know Nothing Party, that nobody can have any alcohol until they're 21. Most people know that students from 18 to 21 will drink at some point or somehow, but we don't want to know about it. Or if we do, we'll give them sanctions. We're talking about introducing people to a way of living, which includes drinking. But we do not do any training on that. Instead, we let 18 and 17-year-olds figure out drinking on their own, though we say you can't do it. But there's certainly a way that this does happen without any attention, and yet we all know about it. In that setting is where a lot of sexual assault happens. Again, this is about our innocence, or about our blinders, about what we want to see, about getting out of our framework so that we can see what really is going on. I do think it's very important to talk about sexual assault in terms of power dynamics and gender. I think that that's very important. I think that's primary importance. But I do think on campuses it's also a matter of drinking. And until we really look at that, not just as student affairs, but the entire university, and that we begin maybe a discussion in this country of whether or not, by having all these punitive sanctions from 18 to 21 or below 18 to 21, are we getting anywhere? Are we really saving lives the way we once thought we were doing by putting the drinking age at 21? Or are we actually going to have an ethical discourse about how young people should learn how to drink? And that may also allow us to finally say, how do we help young people to understand what sexual engagement is about? There's a certain way that that Puritanism of the university in its original setting perdures today by our belonging, if you will, in a know-nothing attitude. Not that the Puritans were that way, but the Puritan insistence of liquor and certain forms of behavior needing to be excluded, that maybe by that silencing, we're really not getting anywhere. And if faculty were more familiar with what is happening on campuses, the way that the police are, we may be able to talk to our students not only in their dorm room, but in the classroom. And we may also be able to talk to one another as faculty members, whether we're adjunct or whether we're tenure track or whether we're tenured or whether we're professors of the practice. We could talk with one another about drinking on campuses or about this extraordinary problem of sexual assault. I teach a course called HIV, AIDS, and Ethics. It's a very popular course. I've been teaching it for years. But I always bring things back to BC. And like even yesterday, they were talking about how married women in Africa are at risk to HIV infection because of the power options of their husbands, who may be migrating and may be truck drivers and may be involved in it. But I said to them, the issue of male domination is not an African phenomenon. It's a universal phenomenon. And I think that as we start talking about sexual assault on campus, it will get us to revisit the question about gender equity in our own ranks, in administration, in boards of trustees, in matters of governance. I think we really need to do something about gender in our own ranks if we're going to be credible to talk about sexual activities among our students as well.
Having written the book and made a case for university ethics, what do you hope happens next?
Oh, great question. So I just did a proposal for a paper at a conference, and it's about best practices. I'm interested in first trying to proffer where I think there's best practices that are being developed already. So I mentioned, for instance, how Penn State has created an Office of Ethics for the university. I think that's a great first step in the right direction, especially by looking at the question of culture. I think that what the president of Brown University did in forming the Slavery Committee, it was a model of organization and of trying to develop a culture to appreciate issues of race on her campus. I think that the Obama administration, in their white paper on sexual assault and the treatment of women on college campuses, and their insistence of making universities accountable for reporting on sexual assault, and that any universities whose status was questionable, that became a matter of transparent record, was really a remarkable step in the right direction. I think that the new faculty majority, which is run by Maria Maisto, which is about adjunct faculty, because she says the new faculty majority are adjunct faculty. I think that that type of movement, along with the Delta Project, are good practices that are taking us forward. So I'm interested, and I'm talking to other people who have interests like my own to find out what they see as positive steps in the right direction. I would love more than anything to speak to boards of trustees. Like, I'm going to Villanova to speak to their board of trustees. They're reading chapters 1 on my argument and chapter 5 on the university geography and the vocation of the professor. And I'll have an opportunity to talk with them about my book. I would love the opportunity, probably at some point, write an open letter to chairman of the boards of trustees of universities to invite me, or somebody like me, to address the question of university ethics. But that's what I'm doing now, is to I've done the book, now it's to raise the consciousness by using the book and using other venues like this in order to say what should be the next steps. And I do think that there are a lot of very good practices that are developing, but it's typical of the university that no one knows that they are, because they're in a different department and they don't know what's happening elsewhere in the university. But the amount of response that I have received on the book, the amount of interest, the amount of excitement that people have when they read it, saying, this is it. This is what I've always been wondering. What's the matter with the university? Well, there's a number of things, other things the matter with the university, but one is it is not building the community that it really could be building, and it's not doing what it teaches.
Is there anything about the book that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
I think having this insight helps me to appreciate colleagues who may not know my argument or my concern, but you can tell who are the faculty, who are the administrators, who are the staff, who are the students, who appreciate what I'm basically arguing as a good. I can tell people who will suddenly say, I really want to move forward. I would say this, a couple of months ago, I, with the provost, hosted a panel on race here in January, and it was a big panel that was well attended by about 500 people on the campus. And I did find that a lot of the professors of the practice were there. And I asked quite a number, I may have just been happenstance, but I asked many of our junior faculty, tenure track, did they know about it or go to it? And I actually didn't find more than a very few. I think we need to ask, what is the formation of our tenure track faculty today in terms of the so-called research expectation and the type of warnings that they get, that they're to make sure that their publications are good. I wonder how many, I don't think BC is, this is just an example, but I do, when you interview people who are coming for tenure track, they're really kind of set on they will teach, they will publish. But will they know the university? Will they work outside that framework? I think really successful faculty do. They start trying to learn more and more about the rest of the university, and they actually get engaged. But I do think that not only does the tenure track faculty member, but also her or his advisor or mentor or chair may actually further instill in them that they should have their blinders on and that they should only look at what they need to do and just do it. There's something the matter with that model. I think that I'm trying to make a case that the amount of blinders that we have at a university are deeply problematic. So whenever I see blinders applying, I'm basically suspicious that something is not going to develop well. And I think the present way, not that BC is doing this in any particular way different from other universities, but I think the way that we're coaching many new faculty who are in the tenure track is something that we should reflect on. And by the same token, I think we have a lot to learn from the professors of the practice who have said that they have a commitment to the university in a way that they may be freer because their relationship is not so research-oriented as it is for the tenure and tenure track. But there is a difference in terms of whether or not we're creating a community in which we all benefit from it.